other resolution to you tonight or tomorrow morning.
Okay.
I got through the questions and comments,
Should I not be
and now I'm
sitting
gonna
too
help
close
with
to
the
the owl?
session tonight,
Okay.
so hopefully.
Yeah.
I'll take
I
the
like to-
honors.
okay, yeah, I joined the comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me that I should.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February 26th meeting of Manhattan's Community Board 5 Land Use Housing and Zoning Committee. I'm Nancy Pasha. I'm the chair of the committee. I'm joined by Julie Chu, who is vice chair of the committee, and the committee members who are present tonight. Please introduce yourselves. First for those in the room, and then if there's anyone online. Janice, would you start?
Sure, Janice Young.
David Sigmund.
Bernal Vikram.
Seth Borden. Azul Zolkowitz. Chris Jackson. CJ.
Who do we have online? Anybody?
Mike Greeley just joined.
And we have Mike Greeley online. Anybody else? Okay. So there are no items to be voted on tonight. This is purely an informational session. It's analysis and research done by the urban planner we hired to help us with the MSMX rezoning plan. We will be holding a public hearing on Zoom on March 19th at 6 p.m. For comments, public comments on the MSMX rezoning plan. And as I said, that's a public hearing. Are there any new business items before we begin meeting tonight? Seeing none, let's move forward. Before we begin, I'd just like to go over how I'm going to be running this meeting. After the MSMX presentation, committee members will ask questions. We will then have questions from the public. And I hope everyone will speak succinctly and avoid repetition of all the prior speakers. Julie will call on you when you raise your hand. Use Zoom's raised hand function. Hit 9 on your phone to raise your hand. Hit star 6 to unmute. After the questions of the public, we will start our business session, and only committee members and board members will participate in the business session. There will be no further input from the public unless recognized by me, the chair. Board members will be promoted to panelists for the business session. We have one item on our agenda tonight, and that is George Jane's analysis of the MSMX rezoning plan. George, thank you so much for presenting tonight.
So happy to be here. All right, I will share my screen, if I may. All right, you should see my screen. Right?
We see it.
Okay, great. Okay. Let me start just by introducing myself, because there are some people I haven't met yet in this room. As Nancy said, I'm an urban planner. I'm here with my associate Alihan Polat, and we work together on a lot of rezoning applications. We do development consulting, but mostly in New York City, we work with community boards and community-based organizations who are trying to better understand how zoning impacts their area. And, you know, it's a bias on our part. We like working with people who care, and people on community boards care. And so we specialize in Manhattan in zoning. There's the R1 through R5 districts, which aren't in Manhattan and are very different. But we focus in on the Manhattan areas, which are the R6 through R10 district, or R12 now. And so today we're going to discuss a very brief overview of the MSMX application. And most of it is, though, going to be talking about how the zoning might play out at actual sites in the district. We're going to then get into some zoning considerations that you all may be considering. And then some comments on the environmental impacts of and commenting on the DEIS. Now, if the chair permits it and there's questions and you need to stop me, that's fine. It doesn't bother me at all, especially if I'm being confusing or not clear. But let me also say that this presentation assumes basic knowledge found in DCP's materials, which are excellent. And there are links. I'm going to leave this deck behind. There are links to DCP's materials in here. And this, for the most part, builds on them. But briefly, the rezoning proposal, as you've all seen, is to rezone the mostly M16 district to higher density mixed use districts and a new special purpose district. The current zoning, with limited exceptions, does not permit housing as of right. Housing would be permitted at up to 18 FAR in the first use of the R11 and R12 districts adopted as part of the City of Yes. Residential FARs up to 18 FAR, up to 18 are permitted in most of the area, not all of it, but most of it. And MIH would be required everywhere, mandatory inclusionary housing. The proposed zoning has bulk controls that are intended to better match the existing context. There's a requirement for ground level street walls and a base that rises at least 60 feet, but can go up to 15 stories. Towers on top of that base are permitted, but that base needs to come to the street line. It's different than the towers you see now. Through lots have to have their rear yard equivalent in the middle of the block, unless they're large sites. And we're going to talk more about that later. But you have the basic ground level rules on the right-hand side here. The existing M16 zoning, it does not match the context. Like, it is an artifact of the 1961 zoning resolution. There are two massings right here on the right-hand side of the screen. It permits a heightened setback building, which is the building that comes to the street. It can rise up 85 feet, and then it sets back following a sky exposure plane. Or permits these small footprint towers, which certainly don't match most of the historic context. And these heightened setback buildings, they generally, especially on interior lots, can't use all the floor area. And so these two building forms are really a poor match for the existing high density, bulky context in the area. And, you know, the proliferation of hotels in the district that you've all seen were in part a result of this existing zoning that's here. So since you can't use all of the FAR in the heightened setback buildings, which give you the nice big floor plates, the smaller towers could get all of the FAR in there. But, you know, you're not going to have an industrial or commercial floor plate that's that tiny. But that's good for hotels, right? So you could have a hotel use in these small towers, but then they leave this big break in the street wall, which is not good urban design. And DCP's special permit has largely stopped the practice, but you know, you have a lot of these open street wall buildings that mark the district, and really they are a result of that M16 zoning. All right, so that M16 zoning is going to be changed. And as a part of the draft environmental impact statement, the city developed this map of projected and potential development sites under the new zoning. This feeds into the reasonable worst case development scenario, which is the foundation of the environmental review. You have the 62 sites in pink here. Those are the projected development sites, which produce all of the housing, or sorry, most of the housing, and create most of the environmental impacts. The DEIS also shows potential conversion sites. So yes, there'll be 62 new development sites that are projected, but there's an expectation that some of the existing buildings, instead of being redeveloped, will be converted into a residential use. And that's most of them, right? That's, or at least not that most of them will, but most of them may or are eligible to be converted into a residential use. And so DCP, as a part of their process, they massed out each of the development sites, the 62 sites, and they produced the reasonable worst case development scenario in this buff colored. And the difference between development with current zoning and development under proposed zoning is what's studied in the environmental review. And so this is the northwest quadrant. This is the northeast quadrant. You see a lot of relatively small footprint buildings, about 300, 400 feet. This is the southeast quadrant. Again, you have, relatively small footprint buildings, topping out at under 500 feet. And this is the southwest quadrant, which is a lower density zoning, and they have shorter buildings. But it's important to understand that the rules required in a reasonable worst case development scenario don't reflect reality. So a reasonable worst case development scenario, what they're studying, cannot assume zoning lot mergers or the sale of air rights. Again, that's when a developer goes to a neighboring building and says, I'm gonna, can I buy your unused development rights and put on top of my building? You can't assume that. You can't assume the sale of air rights in a reasonable worst case development scenario. So none of those buildings we saw have air rights from neighboring lots. And also, this is also very important, assemblages, or the grouping of lots that are currently in separate ownership into a single development site, that's very limited in the environmental review in the reasonable worst case development scenario. And so what we see is development sites 41, 42, 43, and 44 all being evaluated as separate buildings, when in reality, it's very likely that this would be assembled into a single or two sites. So it could be developed more efficiently. And with that understanding, we were asked to select sites in the rezoning area to show how they might be developed under the new zoning. We tried to find potential development sites with multiple tax lots for assemblages. That are outside historic districts, that are next to landmarks or underbuilt tax lots with available floor area to transfer in a zoning lot merger. So you could get a sense, the point of this is to get a sense of how this might play out in reality. And so right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these scenarios. And we have saved static images in this presentation. Alihan is here with our 3D model. And so if you want to explore any of these, take measurements, we can switch from the static version to the active version. But we'll start with the static version, and if we need to switch, you'll let me know. Okay, so our first site is between West 29th and West 30th Street, between Broadway and 5th Avenue. It is developed as, in the reasonable worst case development scenario, it's two different developments, 49 and 48. Under the current zoning, this site was actually proposed to be redeveloped in 2023, I think it was, as a commercial tower with something like this that you're seeing. It was about 550 feet to the top of the bulkhead. And, the tower rules in the, it allows towers for sure in the M1 district, M16 district, but they're restrictive tower rules, and you end up with forms like this. And you could use more floor area from neighbors, but would it make sense for it to be much taller as a commercial building? We didn't think so. And so anyways, this is a reasonable development, but it never did happen under the current zoning. You could also do a building like this with more of a base under the current zoning and a slightly shorter, larger floor plate tower. But again, even here, a zoning lot merger is unlikely. Oh, and let me also say, in all of these, to give you orientation, on the left-hand side is the development site and the zoning lot. The zoning lot would be outlined in red. On the right-hand side is the 3D image. The colors follow traditional land use colors, which are blue is community facility, yellow is red is commercial, yellow is residential, and then these dark colors would be for mechanicals, accessory building mechanicals. All right, and so this is the plan for the alternative site under existing zoning. So under the proposed zoning, we feel that a zoning lot merger to facilitate a 2-building development and use the large site rules would be likely. All right, so what does all that mean? So we think that it's possible to develop a zoning lot that includes all of these lots in it, where the development rights from the existing buildings can be transferred to the different developments on the site, new developments on the site. So we feel that there could be a market rate tower in site 1A, and then your affordable building in site 1B. So this is an MIH area. It requires affordable housing. That affordable housing can be in a single building, or it could be broken up into 2 or more buildings. So what we see in this situation is, because if you're doing a condominium, it is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to do affordable housing, or at least MIH affordable housing, in your condominium. And so what you end up seeing is people break it up, developers break it up into 2 buildings, where you could have your market rate condominium building and then your rental affordable building. So this would be a 100% affordable building in site 1B. This would be your market rate tower. And what we're doing in all of these is we're just showing for reference the height of the new construction at 262 Fifth Avenue, which is the building you see on the right here that's masked out. Just so you have a sense of how big that is relative to something that exists. All right, and so this we felt is a reasonable building. It's 1,000 feet, or just under 1,100 feet to the top of the bulkhead in your market rate building, and it's a completely doable, affordable building on Broadway. And then we have the plan that we show on all of these, where you would have the zoning lot outlined in red, and then the development sites labeled. And then we show all of these with an elevation view, so you could see them in context with the other buildings in the immediate area. But even though this is a very large building, it actually doesn't use all the floor area available. Because it's an 18 FAR district, and this is a pretty big lot. And so you could do a couple of different things here. One, you could really max it out. Or 2, you could make your zoning lot smaller. You could drop lot 26, for instance, from it, and you could have less floor area going into it. We decided to keep it in and try to max it out, or at least a little bit more, or closer to max it out. And you could get up to nearly 1,600 feet to the top of the bulkhead, which is very tall. It's probably too tall. There are buildings that are this tall in the area, but only a handful of them, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about them. But the zoning would permit this, right? It permits a standard tower, especially with the large site rules where you could put the tower in the center of the block. But, you know, we have to say there's a difference between what's possible and what's practical. And tall buildings like this are very expensive. And so while this may be possible, it may also be impractical, and there may be some compromise that's found here. But, you know, I also will say this, is that it'd be one of the very few places where you could look down at the top of the Empire State Building. And so I don't know the market here very well, but, you know, I do know this building very well. This is Central Park Tower. It's in your community district. It is built to 1550. It's at 13.35 FAR. So it has lower FAR than what we're looking at right now, but it's about a comparably sized building. 432 Park Avenue, again, is a comparably sized building, 1,400 feet, built at 14.14 FAR. So, you know, I say it's impractical, but there are buildings out there like it. And it's, you know, I don't know I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but the zoning would permit it. Are there any questions on the first one?
Go ahead.
So if we wanted to avoid these super talls, for example, it sounds like some of the issue is that they're not using the entire lot coverage. Could we institute or ask for a lot coverage requirement to avoid having this play out?
So by having a lot coverage requirement, meaning a minimum lot coverage requirement. So this is exactly how tower on base rules work. So tower on base rules have both a minimum and maximum tower coverage. And what that does is it limits the height of the tower and packs the bulk in the base. Now, the tower on base rules don't apply here, but that's exactly why, you know, on the Upper East Side, for instance, where you have R10 zoning on the avenues, they have to be built according to these tower on base rules, which, you know, top out at around 500, 550 feet. And so, yes, you can play with the bulk rules to limit the height of towers. Now, that ends up decreasing the amount of flexibility because this zoning is very flexible. If somebody wanted to, you know, do a short tower that you know, essentially what they say packs the bulk in the lower floors, they could, right? Because it's very flexible zoning, and you could do the tall skinny building, you could do the short squat building. You have great options, but so I guess there are mechanisms that you could impose to limit tower height without a strict height limit, like packing the bulk, but it would limit flexibility. And so it's a trade-off.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And George, I have a question. In terms of flexibility, since the sites that we're looking at are very unusually shaped, that flexibility, you really need that in there to get a good building, right?
Often, right? Irregularly shaped sites are, you know, they're the bane of an architect's existence, right?
So you want that it's better to have the flexibility.
You know, there are, let me say Nancy, there are trade-offs with flexibility, right? Flexibility, you know, essentially provides relief to the developer, but it ends up making a less predictable building form. And so it's an issue of values. What's more valuable? Is it a predictable building form or flexibility so that developers can do whatever they need to do?
We have some more questions. So
Yeah, George, thank you. So just concentrating on this particular block, 29th to 30th, Boulevard to 5th. So it's gonna be an assemblage of lots. Now, there are a good half dozen that are what, 4 to 6 stories, somewhere in that area.
Yeah.
Now, in other cities around the world, what would be possible is they would keep those facades. They'd do a setback and then start building the base up in a ziggurat form. Is there any possibility that a developer in New York would do such a thing?
Let me clarify a couple of things. Number one, these lots that don't have colors on them, we're assuming a zoning lot merger, so that the buildings that are there right now are going to stay, right? So they're going to stay and they're going to sell their unused development rights to the developer. And so, not only the facades are staying, but the whole building is staying and the tenants are staying. And some of these, I think, are residential buildings. And so we expect that there's nothing that's going to happen to them. Site 1A here, I believe, has already been cleared. But yeah, I mean, there are ways of incorporating historic buildings or facades into structures, but most often in New York City, the way we see that is through the zoning lot mergers, where essentially existing buildings can sell their unused development rights, essentially cash out, and then get to keep their building and operate their building. And we expect that that's actually going to happen here a lot. I mean, because you have a lot of commercial buildings that are functioning, right? They have a lot of tenants. They're cash flowing. And so, why would they redevelop when they could just sell their unused development rights to somebody else, and then they can essentially cash out and keep their asset running? So we expect that we'll see a lot of that. And we expect like every block will have one development site that hoovers up a lot of the development rights from the neighboring buildings, and those neighboring buildings will keep operating.
Seth,
Yeah,
and then Myrtle next.
for those of us who aren't familiar, why is it difficult to do MIH affordable housing in a condo building?
Yeah, it's because of there are a lot of structural reasons for that, right? So you have an offering plan in a condominium building. It has rights and responsibilities which do not nest into the requirements of MIH. I am not the affordable housing expert, but DCP explicitly kept this option available. I don't know, some of you may remember from 10 years ago when there was this outrage over the Pour Door, where there was a building developed that had separate entrances for the affordable units and the market rate units. That you can no longer do in a single building, but you can do it if you have multiple buildings. And that was a option explicitly kept in to facilitate the development of condominium units, because you can't have the MIH affordable units inside the condominiums.
Myrtle?
So, sorry, this is a stupid question, but
No, not at all.
No.
so after, so if there is a zoning lot merger and development rights have been bought and sold, how does MIH work then for the new building that is being developed, which has bought up development rights from everywhere? It would, like, how would that, what percentage, for example, would have to be?
Yeah, it depends.
affordable?
It depends on the option, right? It's the same as if it's doesn't use bought development rights. It's between 20 and 30% of the residential floor area has to be between for affordable housing. It depends on what option 1, 2, or 3. You have differing amounts depending on the depth of affordability. But the non-residential floor area is exempted, right? And so if you're merging with a commercial building, all of that commercial floor area is exempted, and you're just ending up with how much residential floor area do you have? Between 20 and 30% of it needs to be affordable.
Understood. And then my second question is, just say, for example, you do end up with a super tall and you said they're very expensive buildings to build.
They are.
Now, after that, having mandatory inclusionary housing, does that make it not feasible?
That's a very good question. I will say it's going to vary case by case, and it depends on the market and market changes. But I will say that this site is feasible only because it is split into two buildings. Again, I think doing it all in the same building as a super tall would be unfeasible, because then it would be a rental. And generally super talls are never rentals, they're condos. And it just makes it much more feasible breaking it up into two buildings.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for letting me talk. I just wanted to clarify something.
Yep.
You've been talking about 18 FAR residential, but you haven't mentioned the 20% FAR bonus for Pops Parks or transit improvements. So I think that has to be added in to every equation here. And we always need to assume that for the developers to maximize whatever opportunity it is. So I think we have to keep that in the equation. Also,
Do you have a question? We're in questions right now.
okay, so but I'm just, if
Please
we're,
make it into a question.
Let me just say, we're going to talk more about that later. All right.
Okay.
Because there are, it's not only the things you just mentioned, but the 150,000 square feet for a school, right? There are other things you want to get out of the floor area here. And, for this particular site, developers typically want to maximize, but you also want to be able to use the floor area you get affordably. And we think that on this particular site, because, you can max out, you could build such a big building with the underlying floor area that probably people wouldn't use the POPs or school or transit improvement bonus, and definitely not the transit improvement bonus, because that's dealing with the MTA, and it's a very difficult process to get. I mean, and this particular site, there may be other sites where it makes sense, but on this particular site, anyway, we'll talk more about that a little later on.
you.
All right.
Any other committee members have a question? Julie, do you have a question? Julie?
Yeah, George, you mentioned you were gonna mention rear yard equivalents earlier. Is that similar to Samir's question where requiring rear yard equivalent would minimize these towers?
Yeah, that's we're gonna we have a whole slide on that a little bit later. And yeah, that's one tool as well, right? Is that you could this whole thing with large sites. We'll get into that in a little bit, Julie.
Samir, and then we're going to go to the next. The public, we'll ask the public to speak when the presentation is completed.
So from my understanding, basically none of these projects are feasible without a tax abatement. The state passed 485X, which is for condos and rentals. And even then, we don't know if it's going to be feasible even with that tax abatement.
Not for condos.
Not for
Well, you can
condos.
use it for condos.
No.
No.
Okay. So I guess my question would be, so if you can't use it for condos, do we expect this tech project to even be feasible without a tax abatement?
So in the Manhattan core, we see condos going forward without the tax abatement. These are very expensive buildings, and I'm not an economist. I'm not a market person. I don't actually deal with the numbers. I just see what people do, right? And so what we're seeing is, 1,200-foot buildings that are condos with no 485X, and that's not eligible, right? It's for home ownership in Manhattan is not eligible for 485X. Even in Harlem, even in Uptown, that's true. If you're in Queens, you can do it, but if you're in Manhattan, you can't.
Got it. So 485X is not eligible for homeownership specifically in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Correct.
If you may all know why that was done that way, but that's the way it is.
David.
Can I just put a kind of a marker down, George, on this?
Yeah.
This question of, in this case, it's a mid-block site. So kind of following on Samir's question, you could also choose to downzone the mid-block, which has come up a few times in this discussion. And, you know, pick some number that's lower than 18. And, you know, you
Right.
keep it a flexible zone, you could keep all of that, but you just wouldn't allow an 18 FAR 1,500-foot building to be built in the middle of the block.
You know, that's fair. You know, New York City, not everywhere, but in most places, the avenues have high density zoning and the mid blocks have low density zoning. And, you know, that goes back to 1960, right? In 1916, the heights of the buildings were related to the width of the street on which it faces. And so the avenues were wider and so the buildings were bigger. And so that building form has been carried forward in zoning in most places where the mid blocks have lower density and the avenues have higher density. This area is a little different because, you know, on 6th Avenue, you had the L that used to run up 6th Avenue. And so you had lower buildings on the avenue. But, you know, again, that's been gone a long time now. and you know, it's a reasonable question for a community board to consider is should the mid blocks that face narrow streets have lower density zoning than the avenues? It's a completely reasonable question.
Do you know if DCP, you know, had an aversion to this, or was there some specific reason why it didn't end up in their proposal?
I don't know. I don't know. And, you know, the existing zoning, the M16, you know, it doesn't have that feature to it, right? And so it's been like this without a difference for a while.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions? We'll go into the next part of the presentation. Thank you, George.
Okay, so that was just site 1. We're going to look at site 2. This is a site between 25th and 26th Street, between Broadway and 5th Avenue. So it's nearby. This is in the southeast quadrant. We feel like under the current zoning, we might see a pair of commercial towers like this on the site. This is currently, I believe, a parking lot. And you would have, and the way the tower rules here are, they're just so difficult to use under current zoning. You end up with this 2-core tower. It's not a very attractive building from an efficiency standpoint. And then you have a big open area in the front, so it's not good for urban design either. You could also do a height and setback building like this. Get nice bigger floor plates, but you actually couldn't use all the floor area under existing zoning. This is one reason why this site is probably never developed, because the current zoning is just produces forms that are not very good. You know, in either of the cases we just showed, I think that a zoning lot merger is unlikely because of the difficulty of using the floor area under the existing rules. But with the proposed zoning, a residential tower here would be permitted. And you could expand your zoning lot to pick up the church to the east. You might pick up one of the commercial buildings to the north. And you could do essentially a very nice tower. The problem with this site, though, is that it would have to be mixed in the building. We couldn't really find a site here for the affordable building. You could maybe put it in, like if the developer acquired the commercial building to the north, maybe that could be a conversion, and that the converted unit could be the affordable units as a separate building. That's a possibility. We're not doing that. We're showing this as a single tower where it's mixed up together. Now, again, we're getting up to 1,000 feet. And we're not using up all the floor area on this. The height of the 626 Fifth Avenue, 262 Fifth Avenue is there. It's a tall building. And this is a plan view of it. And this is the elevation.
We're using the 262 Fifth Avenue building as a frame of reference for how tall these buildings are. This is the building that's currently under construction, which has that large frame sitting on the top. It looks like construction is slowed down, but it's a marker so that you can understand a frame of reference for the heights of these buildings. Thanks,
Yeah, and
Jordan.
it's more than that. I would say it shows you that these buildings are getting built. It's also an example of like, well, this is 1,000 feet tall, but you got another 1,000 footer right next to it. Which I think is, and I think is important. It's when the Empire State Building is your other frame of reference.
And again, this is mid-block.
Yeah, it's
Right,
mid-block.
this is
Yep,
not
this is
mid-block.
mid-block. Yep. And so if you were to use up all of the floor area on a site like this, you get to 18 FAR. This produces a 1,300 foot building. And if you can't offload the affordable into a separate building, it's likely too expensive for a developer. As you get taller, costs start to increase non-linearly for buildings like this. This is the plan. But the zoning would permit something like this, right? And this is it's possible. It just may not be likely. The third site, any questions about the second site?
Roughly, like, how many homes would we expect? Because as you mentioned, this is currently a parking lot and difficult to develop, and
Yeah.
you're showing towers that may be developable, and I have a schematic that can show height, but we also care about how many homes this.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all, we have the square footage and everything, but I don't have it in front of me. Alihan? You're there, right?
I could, yes, sure. I could report that in a few minutes for all the scenarios.
Yeah, we could tell you. We just have to look it up.
There's a point of reference, if I may.
But what Ankur, I don't know if you were here, in order for a developer to build a building this tall, it's an expensive building, so it probably would not have affordable housing, and you cannot mix condos with affordable housing. So, in a prior, I don't know, were you here for the prior, precinct, the prior?
I saw the tail end.
Okay, because it was that scenario was a parcel with two buildings, a lower rise building that would be for affordable rental, and the tall building would be for market rate condos.
I'm just curious in the total number.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and just on that, the point of reference is the building we're comparing it to in height, 29th and 5th, some 60 stories, 24 units.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that a lot with these duplexes, triplexes, and a new term I learned was a quadplex, which is a building, which is a unit that covers 4 stories in one of these towers. So
one of the things we asked George to do was on all of these buildings to mark in red the height of 262 Fifth. So if it's not looking at an elevation, you can still understand how it relates to that building. I just want to make sure everyone understands that.
Yeah. All right. Let me move
George,
on to the next, unless Alihan, you got that number.
Did you say that you would expect this building to be built shorter as a condo without any affordable units?
You can't.
No, you have to use, no, you have to put affordable. It's MIH. There's no way around that.
I think the thing we're trying to say, George, is that when you get into these higher buildings where you're using up the FAR, the cost is prohibitive for affordable rental units.
So it's likely that nothing would get built, is what you're saying.
Unless you have space to put a separate building
In which
on,
case you don't.
in which case you don't, but maybe George has something in his
Yeah, no,
pocket.
I mean, what may very well happen is that, the church doesn't sell any of its development rights, right? And so that church just sits on all of its development rights, and it doesn't either becomes a development site. No, that's a landmark. And it doesn't get to use its development rights. And a shorter building gets built, which is, or, again, the idea of perhaps converting one of these, acquiring and then converting one of these commercial buildings into a converted residence, that might work as well. There'd be a lot of games. You'd have to really play this one out because there's just not room on this lot for a two-building solution.
George, wouldn't it be difficult to convert the building in pink into residential because it's such a big floor plate or?
Oh, God. It'd be very difficult.
Yeah, it's very, because
There's
you don't
no-
have the windows and this lot line on either side and
Nancy-
it's 10,000 square feet.
Yeah, no, it is very difficult to convert these big floor plate buildings. However, I want to say it does happen. There is a building in Lower Manhattan, one of these enormous floor plate office buildings, where they're cutting a courtyard in the center of the building that goes all the way through the building. And so you end up with windows on all sides. It's actually amazing that they found it economical to do that. A cutting through 40 floors of office tower to create an interior court. So it can happen. It just ends up like, could it happen cost effectively? And that's really an open question.
Okay, George, continue.
Yep. Alejandro, do you have a,
Yes, so for site one, if you want to go back to site one, so the scenario that we kept the tower a little above 1,000 feet would
yes.
yield approximately 570 units if we take an average unit size of 1,200 square feet.
Oh,
And that would be, again, site one, the market rate building. The affordable building would yield 144 units. Again, that will take the average of 1,200 square feet. We could play around with the numbers and increase or decrease the size of average units.
but you're talking about the first scenario. Samir
That's correct.
was asking about the second scenario.
So the site two, we would be creating around 663 units when the building is at 1,000 feet. And we would be creating 835 units when the building is at 1,272 feet.
Got it.
And again, these are all units that assume an average unit size is 1,200 square feet.
Did you say 1,270 units for the super tall?
1272.
No, 830, sorry, you're talking about scenario one, correct?
Yes,
No.
sorry, confused.
So the 1272 is the height of the building. It's
Correct.
not the number of units.
Right.
The
And
the
number of
number-
units was 800 and
35. What you're looking at is 835 units.
again, that's assuming 1,200 square foot per unit, which is, a little on the big side, but you might get that in a super tall.
And that would be all market rate condo.
Well, no, well, that would in this site, because we don't have a separate affordable building, it would have to be mixed into the building, right? I mean, you can't get around MIH. MIH is like, that's a thing. So that's what makes this, when I say it's likely too expensive, it probably is likely too expensive, and you're going to see something like this, and then maybe changes to the zoning lot to reduce the amount of floor area available.
Samir, one more question. We're
Sorry,
gonna
just
move on.
to follow up on that, so the 830 units for the taller building is 830 units, of which 225, assuming we use the same ratio as before, would be affordable?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay,
We're gonna
we're going to go to the third scenario. Okay, third scenario you've seen before. This is the site where the reasonable worst case development scenario that's studied in the EIS is considering this to be 4 different development sites. Between West 27th, West 28th, Broadway, near Broadway, the intersection with Broadway. Under current zoning we have, we're likely to see 2 separate commercial towers on this site, again, because of really difficult zoning to work with, the M16 district. Or you would see your height and setback building. Again, the tower here would be set back from the street. Again, bad for urban design. This would be better for urban design, but you can't use all the floor area and keep your reasonably sized floor plates. Again, one of the reasons that these sites haven't gone. And just to be clear, in terms of graphic convention, the purple hatched areas are landmarked districts, historic districts, excuse me, and the gray hatched areas are individual landmarks when you see these on the map. Okay, so but under the proposed zoning, I think we could get a two-building scenario here, where you would have your market rate building next to your affordable building. In this case, you could use all the floor area by expanding the zoning lot a little bit, get up to 750 feet in your market rate building, 300 feet at on your affordable building. The numbers here work. If you wanted to, well, here, this is it in plan. And this is how it would fit into the skyline. It's substantially shorter than 262 Fifth Avenue. But if you wanted to get a bigger site here, you could definitely do it. So what happens is in historic districts, all the stuff hatched in purple here, you know, you could do development in historic districts. It happens all the time, but typically there are lots of limitations, and you often can't use all your floor area. And so all of these sites have substantial amounts of floor area that they could sell either under current or proposed zoning. And so you could expand your zoning lot a little bit by acquiring unused development rights to the south, and you could do a more substantial building and still do your affordable building next to it. And so if you wanted to go taller, you absolutely could. And in this case, it's still shorter than 262 Fifth Avenue. But in no situation is this going to be developed as 4 different development sites. It's just very, very unlikely to happen. Those are the 3 sites that we really went into. Before I move on, do you want to go into any of the details? Again, you know, Alihan has the real-time model. If you want to fly through it, we can do that. It's up to you all.
Oliver, you had a question.
Yeah, same question from before. How many homes is that?
How many units?
Alihan, help me out.
So let's just look at the scenarios where we maximize the floor area with MSMX. So that would be the second variations for each site where we maximize the towers.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start with scenario 1 first.
No, he's asking about scenario 3.
Okay, sure. So scenario 3 would produce 454 apartments on site 3A and 140 affordable units in site 3B.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right, but that's just 3 sites, right? Where else might we see assemblages? So what I have on the screen is what we call a soft site map, and this is done using current zoning. Generally, if a site is underbuilt by more than 50% or more, it is considered a soft site and colored in dark red. So in this case, you know, blue is overbuilt, yellow is built out, and then shades of red are underbuilt, going to the very dark reds. And that's under current zoning. And you see the southeast quadrant has a lot of underbuilt land. And that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of historic districts here and landmarks, but there's a lot of underbuilt area, especially when you compare it to the northeast quadrant, which doesn't have very much. And when there are institutions on those sites that are unlikely to be redeveloped. But under proposed zoning, the map changes. I'm going to do that again. All right, so this is existing zoning. Again, yellow and blue are built out. Dark red is where you would see development likely. Under the proposed zoning, which is for most of it 18 FAR, 15 FAR on the southwest quadrant, you see a lot more red. And so you could end up with certainly a lot more development sites. And you could see why DCP, when they put together the reasonable worst case development scenario, has 62 development sites in this built up area. It's not like there's vacant land here, but essentially you have buildings that are much smaller than what zoning would allow. And, you know, we didn't go through all of these to assemble it, but you could see, you know, if you, and we have these in the deck and you could play around with them, but you could see there are several places where you could develop assemblages with essentially a bunch of dark red or lesser reds. And those could very well be development sites as long as they're not institutions. The thing that we like to say is like landmarks, condominiums, institutions like utilities like Verizon or Con Ed. Those are they're very likely to be underbuilt, but they're not very likely to be developed. And so you have to be careful when you use this sort of tool to try to identify sites, because there are sites that are underbuilt for reasons very often. And then in the southern part, you know, the historic districts, you could really see them into the detail, a lot of underbuilt area here. And that's likely to stay that way in the historic district. But, you know, these buildings will be looking for places where their development rights may be able to land. Landmarks can now transfer their development rights across streets or further than they used to be able to. But historic districts, buildings in historic districts are still limited by adjacency rules. And so, you know, these buildings will likely try to find places, receiving sites. And some of them will be successful and some of them won't. And so, yeah, I want to now switch a little bit and just talk a little bit about zoning and how it works. You know, as I said previously, we feel like this zoning will facilitate a lot of zoning lot mergers because you have good buildings that are cash flowing and that people don't want to, you know, upset operations. And so they'll just cash out what they can sell to a neighbor. And, you know, they do that through this process called a zoning lot merger, which permitted the existing buildings to sell their unused floor area without demolishing the building. And I like using this building again as an example, the Central Park Tower. How did this building get so big at 13.35 FAR? It's because all of these buildings, every single one of these buildings is on the zoning lot. There are 3 New York City landmarks here, 2 other, you know, substantial, notable buildings, and they all sold their unused development rights to Central Park Tower. And, you know, it doesn't get a lot of attention because, you know, the selling of development rights creates super talls, and that's what you see, the super tall. But what it also does is it removes development pressures from all of the historic fabric buildings. These buildings that sell their development rights are very unlikely to be redeveloped because they can't be built any bigger than what's there. And this is not an accident, right? DCP has made clear that the mixing of old and new and varying forms and heights is desirable. It's a goal. This image is from DCP, the document called Principles of Good Urban Design. I think it was published last year. And so what you see here, you see adapting old structures to include new and existing uses, varying building forms and heights, combining old and new. This kind of skyline is desirable and what DCP wants to see. And while this was done before this zoning proposal was out, MSMX zoning, which permits these towers, helps with these goals. But as we went through these exercises, there is so much floor area available at 18 FAR that its sheer volume, the amount that we have, may interfere with some of the goals. So, for example, this proposal exempts the floor area for schools up to 150,000 square foot on larger sites. Permits a floor area bonus of up to 20% for covered pedestrian space with the special permit. Permits a floor area bonus for transit improvements and expands the area that can receive bonuses for transit improvements. And there's a question that I don't actually know the answer to, but it needs to be posed. If developers can get all of the floor area they can use affordably from their zoning lot, why would they use these other mechanisms? And we think at some of the bigger sites that it's just very difficult to use these other mechanisms in a way that makes sense. Now, DCP has rightly pointed out that there are many very large buildings in the district. But most of these buildings were built as non-residential buildings, and they're designed with these enormous floor plates, especially in the lower floors. And these floor plates are really not ideal. They're bad for residential buildings because you need windows in residential buildings. You need light and air. You need legal light and air for habitability. And so residential buildings will have this slim floor plate to permit the better light and air that every unit, every room and every unit needs. The slimmer floor plates create taller buildings, and after they reach a certain height, they become very expensive to build. And the abundance of floor area creates less demand for floor area from the school exemption, from the covered plazas, transit improvements. And really a question for this board, for you to really weigh in on, I think, is that okay? Is the abundance of floor area the point, or is part of the point getting schools built by developers, getting covered plazas to better the pedestrian realm, and transit improvements so that we can have elevators in our subway stations? What's most important here?
May I ask a question about that?
Ankur has a question.
Sorry, just to understand the question that you think we should ask on that previous slide, abundance of floor area, you mean like the ability to create housing, right? Like that's what floor area is. It what translates into homes for people.
Absolutely. But, in some cases it's, so for years, we have been using floor area as a carrot to get other things from developers, right? So if you have a public plaza, you get a 20% bonus for the public plaza. If you have an arcade, you get a bonus for that. We've been, for, affordable housing, we would give optional bonuses. We used to do that. So there would be ways of using floor area as a carrot to get other things. And I guess, my point to you all is that there are these other things that are listed in the zoning, and the carrot is just not as rich and sweet as it used to be because there's just so much floor area here.
I appreciate that. My question was just trying to understand what you meant by floor area. And I think part of my reaction, and maybe to explain some of the differences in policy, is like, maybe in the past, when the vacancy rate for residential housing was much higher than it is today, maybe we could try to get a lot of additional carrots. Whereas now the housing also is very important and it's a carrot of its own. But
yeah, okay. Yep. Right.
Julie, then David. Julie, just following up on Ankur's question, when does the carrot become a stick? Because in East Midtown rezoning, they were able to require 10,000 square feet of pop space. Like, how did that happen? And can we require POPs with this large FAR that is being?
So Julie, East Midtown is a bad comparable, and I'll tell you why. Because it's really designed for office buildings. And office buildings have these big floor plates. And so you have a lot more flexibility. You could stuff a lot more floor area into those big floor plate buildings than you can in residential buildings. And and also, you know, it becomes a real amenity for the office workers. And so you see the, you know, developers of office buildings, they generally like, you know, like the plaza bonus, and they use it. But, you know, in New York City, in, you know, 30 years ago, a little more, we got rid of the plaza bonus for residential buildings. And this is, you know, there's an opportunity for it to come back here, but, you know, it's an open question on whether it will be used, simply because, you know, there's a lot of floor area. And so how do you use it all?
Can I just clarify something, George, with you?
Yeah.
I believe the point you're making, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's so much floor area available just for housing for these buildings that the developers don't need to give us schools or covered plazas or transit improvements because they already have more than they know what to do with.
For
Does that make
residential
sense?
buildings, at least on the
For
sites that we're massing out, Nancy, that is
But this
exactly
at
right.
least these sites.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a small site, like if you're an interior lot that's, you know, 40 by 100 feet, you may see something because you have fewer options. But, you know, on these bigger sites, you have, you know, just a lot more floor area because of their bigger sites.
Not able to put a school in that though either.
Yeah, that's
on the
true.
smaller side.
That's absolutely true. Okay, so
David has a question.
Yep.
I mean, the only other thing is that there's also no competition from hotels to be an alternative use for these sites. So everything would be housing because we would have built hotels absent the special permit requirement, but we haven't seen one of those. We've seen one hotel application in 2 years. So a lot of these, you know, and in the image that you showed from the DCP package, they all could have been reasonable hotels, many of them. And now the answer probably is it's none and it's all housing. So, you know, I don't know that supplying housing is going to be the issue with these FARs and in the absence of competition from other uses.
got it.
George, you want to continue?
Absolutely.
Can we let George continue on?
Yeah. All right. So then I next have a few topics that I get into the zoning weeds, and I'm going to apologize. I'm a zoning geek, but I think the details are important here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about through lots and rear yard equivalents. And these are really technical concepts, but they're important. So stick with me. Through lots are formed when a lot faces two streets that are opposite each other. All right, so this portion of the lot is a through lot. And lots like this typically have options on where they put their rear yard, or what they call a rear yard equivalent. It could go in the middle of the block. It could go in the, you know, you could break it up into part of the front. You could put it along the side yard line. There are lots of options which create typically, you know, big towers in the center of the block very often. But I mean, it gives lots of flexibility. People like it. But under MSMX, it has a special rule which says that the yard has to be in the middle of the block for most through lots. Right? This is not typically the case, right? If you, and this is very consistent with its urban design goal. The idea is that you have big bulky buildings that are at the street. And so in most cases, if the lot is smaller, you'll end up with a tower on, or a large building, I don't even want to call it a tower, on 30th Street and another on 29th Street. And they may be connected through a, you know, one story through a permitted obstruction in the rear yard equivalent. And this makes sense considering the urban design goals of creating bases that look very much like the existing buildings. Now, however, this is a big however, if your zoning lot is 1.5 acres, so 67,000 square feet or something like that, it becomes a large site. And under the new rules that were adopted for City of Yes, Large sites have no rear yard equivalent requirement. And so if you have a large site, then you can put your tower in the center of the block. If you have a smaller site that's less than 1.5 acres, you couldn't do this. And, you know, a question for this board, and this is really into the weeds, I get it, but it actually matters because, you know, if you're developing a market rate super tall, you want to be in the center of the block because you could have a deeper tower, it's more efficient. And really the question is special treatment for large sites that are get this special treatment only because of the size okay? Or should the large sites be treated like any other lot? Now, you know, when we went through the whole City of Yes process, one of the reasons they put the large sites in there were for the big campuses. When you're doing infill on NYCHA sites, you know, there's Stuyvesant Town. You know, some of the rules just don't make sense when you have these big campuses, and I get it. But you don't have any of those here. And so why would the large site rules apply in this kind of situation? It does provide more flexibility, but it may be a comment that you all want to comment on. I know that was into the weeds, and so if there are questions, I'll pause on that.
Zool.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And this is going to be a question, so let me set this up. And thank you so much for getting into the zoning weeds, because that's really where we have to go with this. So we know that the most environmentally friendly way to live on the planet is in cities, right? But as we build up and we're building towers, we have less air, we have less light. So we need big footprints. So how do we find a way to have big footprints so that we can have green setbacks, green terraces, we can have atria, we can include schools, we can include health clinics, and yet go high, have the density for housing, and also have all the things that we need to support that housing. It doesn't seem to me that under City of Yes, under the prior rules, and under what's proposed here, that we're heading in that direction. What was the question?
You know, I think that's a fair comment, but I will also say is that if you just required the rear yard in the center, it would encourage the breaking of the bulk into two pieces, and it would still result in a large building on both sides, same size. It just wouldn't be a super tall. And you know, the terrible thing about super talls is that they're really expensive to build. They're not green buildings, but you could still have very dense, very tall buildings, just not incredibly tall buildings, and it ends up being much more efficient. However, they won't have the great views and the light and air that you were talking about that the super talls do.
Let me make the question simpler. How do we build ziggurats rather than towers? How do we have setbacks as we go up? How do we have green horizontal spaces?
I am not the designer. I am not the architect. I'm sure that there are an architect that could give you great examples of that. We do have zoning that currently, sky exposure planes that essentially push buildings towards the center of the block. We have tools like that we've used in New York City for a long time, but you then still have issues with the base of these buildings, where you have big bases that are bad for housing because they end up not having enough light and air for windows. So it's a balancing act, that's for sure.
Myrtle.
Is there any precedence for restricting zoning lot mergers?
No, it's an as of right. Yeah, not that I'm aware of. There's no approvals for it. It's a private contract between two individuals, and the city is not involved other than registering it on the property registration system.
Do we have any more questions from the committee? Are you done with your presentation, George, or do you have?
No, I got a couple more. Nancy, I got a few more.
Let's go. Let's continue on. Then we'll get the public.
Okay. All right. So into the zoning weeds. All right, so mandatory inclusionary housing and differential FAR. So as I said, I work with a lot of community boards, some that have seen substantial MIH areas. And in other areas, like this is an East Harlem issue. We see MIH areas that, you know, could have housing or non-residential development. We're seeing non-residential development happen where MIH buildings were expected. And even when the building is smaller than what the MIH building was. And so sometimes a slightly smaller non-residential building is better for a developer than a larger MIH building simply because of the costs of providing the affordable housing. It all depends on the market rates that are balancing it out. And the FARs in much of this area is 15 FAR for non-residential development and 18 FAR for residential development. A lower non-residential FAR, which you already have in the southeast quadrant, may encourage more residential development by making the non-residential development less attractive. Conversely, equal FARs would make non-residential development relatively more attractive. And so balancing this differential tells us what you're prioritizing. So in the southeast quadrant, because there's a big differential here, you're prioritizing residential over commercial. In the northwest quadrant, you're prioritizing, you're still prioritizing residential over commercial, but less. And I'm just saying that tuning that difference between residential and non-residential FAR tells you what your priorities are. And so if you have priorities for what you would like to see, you may wish to tune the FARs to advantage one over the other. There's not a right answer to that.
Are you saying that if we propose something like reducing the commercial FAR in the district would allow the MIH FAR higher, it might encourage more housing? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So if this were 12 and 18 FAR in these areas, you might get more housing out of this because you're essentially competing. Yeah, developers, are weighing, do I do non-residential or do I do residential? Well, a difference between a 12 and an 18 is substantial, and it may tip that decision toward more residential housing, more residential development. Alternatively, if some of these areas are very commercial already, you may want to increase the commercial FAR to make that more attractive. It all depends on what you're looking to see. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Do you,
okay.
Any other questions you want to continue on?
Yep.
Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I got a few things. I got, if you need me to wrap it up, I'll go really fast, but.
No, I think this is the stuff we want to hear because you've really gone into the weeds. We have not.
Now I'm really into the weeds. All right. I'm going to talk about something probably nobody here knows anything about. So there are these things in zoning called E-designations. E-designations are environmental requirements relating to air quality, noise, and hazardous materials that are actually in an appendix of the zoning resolution. So with an E-designation, if there's a property with an E-designation, these topics have to be investigated and addressed before building permits are obtained for redevelopment. And so we rezoned a lot of manufacturing lands for residential use, and they always get an E-designation. They often get an E-designation. You got to clean them up before you put people living on them, right? It makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of them. Right now I'm looking, all these blue dots are where all of the E-designations are in this general area. There's a lot in the the M16D area, which allow for housing because when that area was rezoned, it essentially said, well, if you're going to put housing here, you got to make certain it's clean. The E designations will be mapped for some of the 62 development sites, but no E designations are proposed for the conversion sites. The DEIS actually says this. It says that for conversions, significant adverse hazardous materials impact cannot be precluded and would be unmitigated in the conversion sites. When I read that, I was like, really? I was like, this isn't it's not heavy industry, but this has been an industrial area for a long time. And, who knows what's happening in some of these buildings? And, is this okay? Is there a way to ensure that the impacts from hazardous materials in these conversions where people will live could be mitigated as a part of this action? It's an open question. I've never actually seen anything quite like this because typically, as you can see on this map, you see E designations are common. They're everywhere, but they are exempted. The conversions are not identified. And is there a way of figuring that out? And this is something that the community, if your community board thinks that it's important, it's something you could advocate for. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Myrtle?
What exactly is the process for getting an E designation? Like, how long does it take? Like, how much paperwork is involved? Or
it's normally part of the environmental review process, right? So there will be, and on the development sites, many of the development sites will have E designations. And they're going to have to, when they're redeveloped, they're going to have vapor seals, and they're going to have to investigate whether the soil's been contaminated, and they are proposed to have E designations. It's just that the conversions aren't. And is there a way of looking at the conversion sites? And part of the reason is that there are so many possible conversion sites. It would mean that nearly everything has an E designation, and I don't think the city wants to do that. But is there a compromise? Is this something that you could have a conversation with the Environmental Review Division to see if there's a way of figuring this out before it leaves the ULURP process?
Ankur.
Okay.
I appreciate the recommendation, but just to make sure I understand the trade-off, if we had the E designations, the developers would be responsible, and it would be a cost, and it might reduce the viability of housing. Is that right?
Yes, it is. These are not. They're not free, right? There's work involved in them.
It sounds like it wouldn't be free. Like you have to. It sounds, but I'm not an expert here. That's why I was asking.
Listen, I'm not a hazardous materials expert at all, right? I just, they're common. It's not like an uncommon requirement. E designations are common, and it's just notable that there are none for this. Okay.
Okay, Samir.
Is ECP on? Like, could we ask them why they didn't?
Well, let's just keep.
So I have
we
a different question.
We have the questions from the public next,
sure.
and they've been waiting a long time.
So for these other M zones that were rezoned for residential, where were those? Were any of those in Manhattan, or are those typically in zones that are, I don't know, doing more industrial work? Right?
Yes. So there's a bunch of them in Soho, NoHo. There's a bunch there. The M16D that you see on your screen, which is this area that I'm hovering over, there's a bunch of them there because that was rezoned in 2011 to permit some conversions for residential uses. Yeah, it's not an uncommon thing.
George, what you're saying, let me clarify this. What you were saying is in conversions, the E designations, removal of those hazardous materials is not required for a conversion. Is that what you're saying?
There are no EZ designations in conversions. That is correct. None.
So if you're converting a building from industrial or commercial to residential, and there is no E designation, it's not considered, although it may have hazardous materials within that building.
Yeah, and again, it says it right in the EIS. Hazardous materials impact cannot be precluded and would be unmitigated. So it's disclosed.
But I want to push back on that, sorry. Just want to make sure I understand. But please, David.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, insurance companies have something to say
Exactly.
about that also. So anybody buying one of these buildings is going to do a complete environmental testing and determine what these issues are and, you know, because they know that if they're gonna have people living there, they don't want the exposure of, you know, they don't want to expose their tenants to radioactive waste if that's what's in the building. So they're gonna go ahead and test it. They have to test for asbestos and all sorts of things anyway. So, you know, they'll test for this as well, and their insurance company and lender and everybody else will make sure that, you know, it meets standards.
Okay, let's go on to the
All right,
next.
so I just got very few comments on the EIS. So there's a whole, as a part of the application, there's a whole draft environmental impact statement. It's enormous, it's gigantic. But like if you have a topic area that you're interested in, like if you're a transportation nerd or really into schools or libraries, there are chapters, right? There are chapters that are actually doable. There's also a really good executive summary that goes through what the impacts are. And, you know, essentially the reasonable worst case development scenario that we've already talked about, it will be populated with people. They're projecting nearly 10,000 new dwelling units, 16,000 people, and these people, and this will create impacts. And the DEI discloses significant adverse environmental impacts in these areas: open space, shadows, historic resources. The transportation chapter is amazing because the traffic and transit and pedestrians, they're already bad and they're just going to get worse. And there's the mitigation. There is some mitigation that they propose, but a lot of it's going to be unmitigated, meaning it's going to be significant impacts that are unmitigated, especially in transportation. There are lots of construction impacts. They're all disclosed in there.
So George, just like this community board did for One Vanderbilt and East Midtown, rezoning grew out of that. Various people on this community board took on certain parts of the DEIS to write back comments and concerns. So this is something we could do, but I understand the clock is different for responding to the DEIS than it is to our resolution, which is due at the end of March, beginning of April. We have more time for that, right? What's our timing on the DEIS comments?
So the last bullet point is written comments on the DEIS are due 10 days after the City Planning Commission holds its hearing.
So we still have time to do that.
Yeah. So you could get your recommendation in on the ULURP application, but you know, you can still put together your comments on the
well, it can come later.
On the EIS later. And you know, in addition, if I may, like there's a lot of information in there. And so there are great things that community board may wish to comment on. For example, the DEIS discloses that it expects that 779 private sector businesses and 5,300 jobs are going to be displaced. What happens to them? You know, you may want to ask about initiatives or policies to aid displaced businesses. For example, will there be programs that will assist displaced businesses in finding new space? These are people often at these manufacturing firms, they don't know real estate, and they may need some help to try to find new affordable places that their workers can still get to. This is something that can happen. This is often part of a points of agreement where the city sets up initiatives to try to assist people who are negatively impacted by zoning actions like this. The DEIS discloses that no significant impacts on schools, but it says that the elementary schools will be at 98.9% utilization and intermediate schools will be at 100.7%. And so, you know, there's a question. What does full utilization practically mean for these District 2 schools? Has there been consultation with DOE? You know, each school they measure utilization differently. Sometimes rooms that are not used for instruction get counted in the space. And so 100% utilization may affect different schools in different ways. There's also no significant impact on libraries, but there's a 5% increase in dwelling units per branch. And so are library improvements being considered as in association with the rezoning? And this is, in libraries, the way they're evaluated, it's in the EIS, don't make a lot of sense with how people currently use libraries, which now provide a lot of services, which they didn't used to. And those services may be more highly utilized and not evaluated at all when it comes to the seeker criteria. And then, this is currently largely a non-residential area. And, are there local concerns regarding hospital capacity, ER service, police, fire? These services largely are serving a non-residential population now. If this switches to substantially residential, are they prepared to provide a different level of services? And this is the kind of thing that the community board is really uniquely situated to comment on and try to get services to, essentially assist your community. And then finally, this is the last slide. Your comments on the DEIS, when you prepare them, they can be very wide-ranging. You can ask for additional analysis, information. You could ask for mitigation considerations. Be creative. The lead agency must respond to all comments in the FEIS. So it's not like a lot of these things where you sometimes put in a comment, you don't know if you're heard. They have to repeat your comment and then provide an answer. And then it's possible to include mitigations and points of agreement that the city is going to adopt to support improvements in a rezoning area. This is something that's common, right? If there's a rezoned area and there's going to be more people using services, the city needs to commit resources outlined in a points of agreement to support the services that the new population and the existing population will need. That's a very important document. It will be between the city and the elected officials. And, making certain that your voice is heard about what you need is going to be important. And again, your comments on the EIS is separate from your approval or disapproval of the ULURP application. You could address it all later. That's it. And thank you very much for your patience on all of this. Happy to discuss any more.
Thank you, George. That was very informative. Are there any more questions from the committee before we go to the public? Because they've been waiting patiently and I would like to get to them. We can come back and do more questions, but I think it's time to give the public a chance. Can you wait? Julie, okay, Julie, she's the co-chair, vice chair.
You did mention open space, and in our district, we've had some conversions where they couldn't provide the required open space from commercial to residential. I guess I'm wondering, for all these conversions, potential conversions, are we gonna be seeing the same thing with all these buildings becoming residential?
Yeah, I mean, so the way
Got rid of
that. Yeah.
Even worse.
Yes.
well, no, I mean, the open space ratio, yeah, that's not really a thing. But for environmental reviews, you have to evaluate how much open space is available for residences, right? For people who live there, and you can have impacts on open space. And this discloses that there are expected to be significant adverse impacts on open space. This area doesn't have a lot of open space, right? And so you're adding 16,000 new people. It's increasing the utilization for the little open space there is. And I completely get the idea of trying to have the covered pedestrian areas, and we create more open space because it's going to be needed when you're going to have a lot of residences. That goes back though to the idea of, if you leave it completely optional, will it actually get built? And that's a very open question, Julie.
So let's go to questions from the public. Joe Rose.
Former board chair, former director of city planning, currently chair of the Flatiron Benefits working group on this.
Can everyone hear Joe?
So I just wanted to say hello and George, a terrific presentation. Just to correct you, there is somebody here who knows what the E designation is because he wrote it.
Yeah.
And by the way, all Sixth Avenue, the rezoning of Sixth Avenue to permit residential use from the M16 was done, it was all E designations. And the reason for the creation of it was to allow for the zoning to be changed without having to do a site-by-site examination of the hazardous conditions, because you do, when you convert a use, you do want it to have that exploration done. That's an interesting point. I missed that in the reading this. Question, this is just a question. We will be, by the way, submitting, and I'll spend some time to answer some of the questions that were raised here, just in terms of condo versus rental, what you can do, why the, just to do some follow-up discussions. But you, George, you mentioned at the outset that the EIS was precluded from considering zoning lot mergers and air right transfers. I'm unfamiliar, I'm just curious, where is that statutory? Is that just in the EIS handbook in terms
Yeah,
of
it's
the
technical
standard
manual.
practice? But it's not a statute, it's not a statutory prohibition. It's just the standard way in which it's being done.
It's in the technical manual, right? So the technical manual tells you how to define your reasonable worst case development scenario.
It doesn't preclude you from doing analysis of zoning lot mergers if you wanted to do them. I'm just ordinarily, we would have looked at these things. They're issues that need, I'll just say, this is not meant, I'm not editorializing, just there's analysis that can be done. It wasn't done in this case, but it can be done. And this is, your analysis here is very helpful in terms of looking at questions to be asked.
Let me comment on that, is that I would love to see a modernization of the reasonable worst case development scenario to reflect reality. I hate having to come to this committee to say, well, this is the reasonable worst case development scenario. It's complicated. People spent hundreds of hours developing it, and then to tell you, but it doesn't reflect reality. That's like a ridiculous thing. And so I fully support what you're saying, Joe. I don't know I'm not a lawyer. So the mechanics of that. I think maybe just changing the technical manual would be all you need to do, but I am not 100% sure of that.
But that's not, but Joe, that's not part of this
No, I know. Pro or con,
effort.
the proposal will benefit from some of the questions that are being looked at and discussed either way in terms of the, we'll come back to you.
Okay, are there other questions from people, public in the room? There's someone behind you. You did have one question in the back.
Yes. So I was curious about the scope of the, you mentioned that there's the DEIS comments that I believe CB5 will have the opportunity. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That CB5 will have the opportunity to ask and respond to. One of those things, like has been mentioned, is like, okay, if there's a real problem with open space, we have a lot of new housing, which is fantastic, really great to see. But not many opportunities to create new open spaces. And I'm curious if it is sort of, you said DEIS can be wide ranging, but is it wide ranging enough to say like, oh, we could, Broadway is right there, it cuts through this district. The DOT has been, turning more and more of these Broadway, parts of Broadway into plazas, but it's been pretty slow. It's not really, as far as I know, part of the DIS right now, but can that be part of the conversation that CB5 brings in as a comment?
Yes, we will take a look at it. We may have our transportation committee take a look at it, but thank you. And the gentleman at the end of the table.
Hi, my name is Brian Weber. Some of you know me. I'm a public member on Community Board 4. I live in the northwest quadrant of the plan. I'm also a member of the Garment District Alliance and I'm the president of the Midtown South Precinct Community Council. I know these streets and buildings very well. George, when DCP first approached the community, I don't know, around a year ago, they talked about this plan in terms of releasing restrictions on conversion of manufacturing to residential. And at the time, at those community sessions that DCP held, public community sessions, those of us who lived here came out and said, we would love new neighbors. We think it is a wonderful opportunity to allow for the conversion of this built environment to residential. But the built environment is very important to us. We live in these manufacturing loft buildings. We know how they can be turned into housing and how that could be expedited and how DCP can help it.
Sure.
And that was what we were originally presented with. The new plan that DCP is going forward with not only releasing those manufacturing restrictions, but proposing an 18 residential, 15 commercial with 20% bonus. Does that incentivize demolition of the built environment as opposed to conversion? And how does that timeline differ for generating new housing? It's kind of a dense question.
Yeah, no, it is a dense question. And I would say, you know, from our exercise in massing these out, is we will find, you know, there will be development sites that do hoover up, that do suck up a lot of unused development rights, which is great for preservation, right? You want your big, you know, industrial loft building to be able to sell its unused development rights to someone else who's going to build it, because it's good for the building. You get the cash out. It essentially preserves the building forever. The issue ends up being, is there too much floor area? Will there be enough opportunities for these industrial loft buildings to be able to sell their development rights to neighboring projects? And there is a lot of floor area at 18 FAR. It's enormous. And so the question is it, you know, is it so much that it doesn't allow as much preservation as possible? And that may very well be the case. We haven't really answered that definitively, though. It's suggestive.
Okay, Jim Wright, we're gonna call on you now. You have your hand up. Can you unmute him, please? Okay, Jim?
Yeah, I think I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Really a great presentation, George. And Community Board 5, I commend you for taking this on. And it's particularly interesting. I live in the southeast quadrant, so your examples are relevant. I'm going to speak more on planning than zoning. And the reason why, I want to kind of go back to the basic goals of the plan. And the question here is this proposal by DCP actually meeting the goals of the plan that have been articulated? And I'll just repeat those for those of you who aren't looking at some of the websites, but one was create vibrant mixed-use communities, which is housing and local communities. I think they're focused on that. And they seem to have a number that they're looking at, which is kind of driving the FAR numbers. The second one is support critical economic activity, which is they list as subcategories of economic activity and improve connections. I frankly don't see that here. And third was enhance neighborhood character. And the subcategories are buildings and neighborhood and public safety. I guess my question here is, are we sort of losing the planning with an overemphasis on zoning? And I'm going to ask just a couple of questions here. One, these four quadrants are isolated M1 districts that over the years are, you know, their own sort of leftover areas of changing uses over the years. But they're sort of arbitrary in terms of how they fit with the adjacent neighborhood. So I'm really thinking about this more as that it should be thought of more as a planning exercise. How do you plan good communities, neighborhoods? And one example I'll just point out, southeast and southwest quadrants are set back from 6th Avenue. And Joe Rose just mentioned the rezoning on 6th Avenue. Again, this is sort of another leftover of a different rezoning. It happened at a different time, but effectively severs the 6th Avenue corridor from considering how that could interact with the residential quadrants on both sides. And coming back to planning, again, typically, and George, you mentioned this, historically, higher zoning FARs have occurred on the broad avenues where you have more opportunity for light and air, and the interior parts of the blocks would have lower zoning. So it's curious to me that what looks to be the common outcome here is really tall, and I mean really tall, even beyond 262 Fifth Avenue buildings on interior lots where you combine zoning lots. And the sort of edges along, within 100 feet of the avenues are left untouched. And it just seems to me a really odd way to think about creating vibrant neighborhoods. I haven't looked at the DEIS, and I do plan to get into that. And I hopefully will come up with some ideas, but I have one basic question. And I understand George, your supposition that there's not going to be a lot of incentive to convert commercial buildings, but that was really a big part of the change in allowing commercial to residential by the state legislature. So is there a way to create more incentives for commercial to residential conversions, which would, not to use a negative word, but soak up some of the housing goals here that would maybe allow for shorter buildings at mid-block? And I'll just leave it at that, but I sort of throwing out a bunch of ideas there. Thank you.
Chair, can I answer that last part?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes,
So the state has put out this subsidy for conversions, non-residential to residential conversions. I forget the timeline for it, but it essentially will sunset relatively soon. The idea is to try to get these conversions to happen sooner rather than later. And so, that's happening. We've changed zoning to, as part of City of Yes, to be a little bit more friendly for non-residential to residential conversions. So, I think there are mechanisms in place that will support conversions, but it's going to be case by case, right? And it's so much has to do with what the building is now, how it's structured now, how it is used now. And it's going to vary from lot to lot and owner to owner a lot.
Can I ask you a follow-up question then?
Yeah, sure.
Is it feasible to put a residential addition on top of a commercial building?
You can. It ends up being very difficult in some ways because you have to have different entrances and different elevators.
Right.
And so you end up with core issues, and it's physically possible, but it just is, it's hard.
I guess the question is it economically feasible?
It will all depend on the market and the specifics of the building.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the public that are online? Okay, seeing none. Any other questions? Let's go back to our committee now, because we just have our committee. So now I think we'll go into executive session where we only have questions from our committee and our board members. So questions? Samir?
I wanted to understand for the DIS, when we talk about schools,
Yeah.
why were schools not seen as a significant adverse impact? Like what utilization rate you need to get to for it to be significant?
So you have to be over 100%. Okay, this is from memory, so I might be wrong on this, but from memory, you have to be over 100% utilization and move the needle 5 percentage points. So you have to go from like 105 to 110% for it to be considered a significant impact. The idea there is that, you know, if you're moving at just 1 or 2 percentage points, even if you're at 150% utilization, that's not a significant impact. The idea is that this action needs to move the needle in some sort of significant way, and you need to be over 100%.
Thank you.
Zool, then Myrtle.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much, George. I mean, you've given us so much to think about, and there's really so much here that we really need to be concerned about as a board, as we have this residential convergence, not only open space, but green space, and of course, air and light, and of course, fire and hospital and schools and libraries, and that really hasn't been well taken into account. And then the concern that Jim Wright just brought up, I mean, a lot of the hope was with some of these manufacturing buildings that there would be very nice residential conversions using those buildings. And it looks like, you know, those subsidies are going to sunset rather soon. So here's my last quixotic question for tonight, because I think what he really pointed out here is we've got a lot more here in terms of zoning than we do in terms of planning. So the universities have used eminent domain to do all kinds of things. Is there any possibility of, you know, in the future at all for the city, for, you know, starting with the community board, our council members, and going up to borough president, mayor, so is there any possibility of seeing eminent domain to really plan this residential conversions as it's happening to allow the open and green space that we need, the hospitals and the schools that we need?
So eminent domain is a tool. It is used. It is especially used by the state in general project plans. You know, the state has been proposing one just, you know, in the Penn Station area. It is something that is not unheard of. And if you feel like, you know, if you feel you need a drastic action, that's what that is. And you can advocate for that. You know, there's a GPP, general project plan, which permits the state to condemn properties, which they've instituted around the Penn Station area. I know that there's going to be some open spaces that they create with that. Is that enough? Is there a way to expand that to include other areas or map that? That is the kind of thing that your board can advocate for if you think it's appropriate. It is a blunt instrument. And so it is a tool that should be used carefully.
Hey, Myrtle?
So my question is more of a clarification. Sorry if it's taking me a bit to keep up, but the way I understand it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's plenty of FAR, don't need any more, none of the bonuses that are on top of the FAR are likely to be taken out. Is that
I don't want to say it as emphatically as that. I say it on these big sites that we looked at next to the historic districts. They would likely purchase floor area from their neighbors as opposed to go and, you know, go through the process of doing a covered pedestrian plaza or a school or something like that, because that's harder. That'll be a harder process. Now, again, you know, if it's a more isolated area and it's a smaller lot, they might do that. We just didn't examine the smaller isolated lots because they're simpler and less interesting, and less unexpected. And they will look like what DCP studied in the reasonable worst case development scenario. So there may be opportunities. It's just not going to be a lot of opportunities, or it's not going to be every site that looks for that.
But the smaller lots probably are not feasible for something like a school.
Yeah, no, and you have to have I think it's at least a 20,000 square foot lot for that. So I don't know. Maybe somebody will come up with a site that can use that 150,000 square feet that's exempted from floor area, but that's a lot of floor area.
And there's all kinds of restrictions with that. You have to have separate entrances and exits, and there's more, and there's security issues, and you've got children living
And in
in the
playground.
building. And playground. So, do we have any, Ankur?
Yeah, we heard from some of the folks who were commenting from the public about a preference to see a version of this plan perhaps that encouraged more conversion rather than new construction. When you went through the new construction buildings that the plan might produce, you noted buildings or sites that would have 500 or 600 apartments, 800 apartments. If we had a plan that was more conversion oriented and less oriented towards building new housing, do you think converting existing industrial buildings in the area could produce that same number of housing, or is that unlikely given the floor plans and the layouts?
I think it's unlikely. But there is room for some of that because again, the way the zoning, because it's unlimited tower height districts and it's not a tower M base with other constraining rules, is that you can sell your unused development rights in these converted buildings to a neighboring tower, and they can build their tower taller. It's just, will there be enough receiving sites for the floor area from the selling sites? And, that's really an open question. So, there's certainly opportunity for conversions, and conversions do make sense considering the zoning that's being proposed.
And before, anyone else have a question? Before Samir. Okay, go ahead.
This is just I guess a broader question. I don't know if you have the answer, but I feel like when DCP talks about this project, they talk a lot about 45X and rentals and that tax abatement, how it's going to create rentals. It sounds like from your presentation, you don't think that's going to happen. But I just want to understand, why do you think that's not going to happen? Why do they think that's going to happen?
Well, okay, so in the Manhattan core, we see a lot of condominiums over the past 10 years. And it's because it's serving a luxury market. The Manhattan core has become attractive to people who have a lot of money, and they very often want to build condominiums, and they're attractive neighborhoods. And so we see a lot of condominiums. Now, there is an open question, Samir, about will 485X change that calculation? And, the final rules for 485X weren't released until December of 2024, right? The rulemaking was going on until December of 2024, just 2 months ago. And DCP says, well, now that you have all these subsidies, people aren't going to do so many condos anymore because, they can't take advantage of the subsidies of 485X if they do that. And they might be right. I just know that most of the luxury buildings we see getting built in the Manhattan core are condominiums. And that may change because of 485X. I haven't seen it change yet.
Thank you.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the
comment on that?
only other comment is that this sort of disconnect on the 18 FAR influences how the development happens, because every owner is going to be like, oh, I have 18 FAR, I'm going to put it out on the market.
Right.
And, if developers look at that and say, well, I can't, for rental, I can't build 1,000-foot tall building. It doesn't make a lot of economic sense.
Right.
I can't use your 18 FAR. I'll offer you 60 cents on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
you know, to build what I can build, and then you just end up in a standoff where nobody is selling, nobody is buying.
Building.
Part of the issue with, you know, the timing of how these programs work, the benefit period burns off.
Right.
So it goes from 35 years to 30 years in 2026. So this program will be just out of the gate, and the benefit is already going to drop. And 5 years on a 35-year program is a lot. So there are some challenges to making it work.
And David, isn't it also a fact that developers do better with condominiums because they develop it, then they sell it right away, they get out? Because they're into the business of developing properties, not holding on to assets, not managing rental buildings. Am I right?
Yeah, but I mean, the MIH should change that math, you know, because it's the only way you're going to build a condo tower like that is if you can find a site that's big enough to accommodate an affordable building, you know, in the same zoning lot.
Right.
There aren't going to be that many of those. So, you know, we found 3 of them or 2 of them. You know, so I don't know. It's possible that then again, the market has to reset and say, well, guess what? I can't find a site without demolishing a lot of buildings. I can't find a site that lets me both build a reasonable sized tower and build an affordable building next to it. So the play moves to rental developers.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody? Have we exhausted? It's 8 o'clock. We're doing very well. If not, George, thank you very much for all of your information. And I agree.
Hey, thank you. The work that you do is really important, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
And I think that, of course, we will post this recording on our YouTube channel so that many people can watch it. And that our next meeting on this will be a public hearing, as I said, where the public and all of us will come to give our comments once we've had a chance to digest what we've been presented from DCP and from our urban planner. And I thought this was important because it's very difficult to hear something and immediately respond. You need to let it marinate, and then other thoughts come to mind. So that public hearing is going to be Wednesday, March. Yeah.
19th.
Wednesday, March 19th. And people can also send in their written comments to office@cb5.org until March 18th. So we will have the written comments as well.
Is George's package going to be made available also?
Yes, the deck. You'll give us, we can
Yes.
post the deck.
I will have to correct a couple of typos I saw as I was going through it, but I will get that to you in the morning.
Okay. We've been working, George, really hard.
And that will go to our website?
Okay. Do we want to see if DCP has any questions?
Yeah, sure.
DCP, are you there? Andy? Do you want to raise your hand? Do you have any questions?
I'm okay right now. I think we're going to take what George presented, digest it, and come back with a response, but thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, great. What?
Yeah, I guess maybe we can follow up on the questions we sent you. Do you think you'll have it for us before our public hearing on the 19th?
That's our aim, to have it before then. There are a lot of questions, but we're working through them the best we can.
I sort of feel like some of the questions we gave you weren't really geared toward zoning and this rezoning plan. And I think it's okay if some of those questions, because there's over 100. Julie's being very tough on this, so see what you can do.
We have questions.
Do we also now want to ask DCP about?
Do you want to ask, can we ask you some questions? Andy?
I will try my best to answer.
He was really here to listen, but do you have,
Well, the E-designation question, since,
E designation question?
Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. unfortunately. We'll definitely respond comprehensively to everything George presented and also questions that we heard today.
Okay, great. Jim Wright has his hand up. Jim, you have something else you want to add?
Yeah, just one question, and this gets back to where the estimated housing units would be coming from. It's a question to DCP. Is there a chart or breakdown either in the DEIS or background material you have that identifies specifically where the number of units by zoning lot you're projecting?
We do. It's in the environmental materials.
Could you point us to that location?
Sure, be happy to.
Okay,
I'll send that to the chair.
great, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, I think we're ready to adjourn unless anyone has any final comments or statements or questions. Anybody, including Andy or George?
And Samir.
Samir.
I just thought this was a very good presentation. I learned some stuff, so I thought it was great. I really
Awesome.
appreciate your time.
Is George
That's
gonna
great.
be on the 19th?
What's that?
Is George gonna be present for the call on the 19th?
I don't know, George, can you be present for the public hearing on the 19th?
I am supposed to be at Community Board 7 on,
Okay,
I
all right,
apologize.
that's fine.
Okay, just one more
Yes.
thing. Are we, the question about the jobs that are going to be displaced, is that one of the things that's in the?
That's in the DEIS.
No, our question is, okay.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, I guess we're ready to adjourn. Does someone want to move to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, second. Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you all, and thank you, George, very much. And also thank you to Colin.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank you.
Nancy.
All right, bye now.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
We don't want to.
Can I